for the University
Say it.
of Michigan School of Kinesiology. Anybody who knows me knows I'm a Buckeye. And so, all right, I have some and I'm up here in Michigan, and so that makes things harder for me. But and some of you probably hate me now, but
Yes.
yeah, I know at least one person does. Yeah, faculty lecturer at UM, also the creator and host of the Wellness Paradox podcast, produced in conjunction with University of Michigan. And then he's also the founder of Applied Fitness Solutions and the Michigan Moves Coalition. He does not sleep. Mike is an exercise physiologist by training and a health entrepreneur, health educator, and fitness industry advocate by trade. He's dedicated to enhancing the standard of practice of and advocating for fitness and wellness professionals to ensure they become an essential constituent in the healthcare delivery system. Please give a warm welcome to my friend and colleague, Michael Stack.
Thanks, buddy. Appreciate it. All right, good morning, everyone. You can hear me all right without the mic, right? Okay, great. Give me 1 second to get away from this presentation and to the other one. Thank you, everyone, for coming out to, I don't know when we've held a MFA regional event in Michigan. David, have we held one here? He's not paying, shockingly, he's not paying attention to me. Have we ever held a regional event here in Michigan?
I don't think so.
That is, given your affiliation, that's not surprising. So we're going to talk about the topic of advocacy today. And it's somewhat fitting that we're talking about the topic of advocacy in the capital of the state of Michigan, because a lot of my experience in the advocacy space has been here in the state of Michigan. And I fully realize that we are in election season right now, and we're about to talk about politics to some degree. And so I also fully realize that that may be your kind of default position when someone wants to talk about politics. But I think we all remember this. And certainly if you were here in the state of Michigan, you remember this. And this is not a political statement in the least, but we were one of the states that were closed for the longest period of time, and we kind of went back and forth with capacity challenges and things like that. So without a doubt, politics and policy decisions, they affect us. And so I was there right with you. If you're here in Michigan or wherever you're at around the country, we were sitting closed for a while, just like everyone else. And here in Michigan, we actually decided to do something about it from an advocacy perspective, like happened in a lot of other states around the country. So starting in May of 2020, we formed the Michigan Fitness Association, which unfortunately has the same acronym as the Medical Fitness Association. So that just makes things really, really messy when I have conversations. But I didn't know anything about advocacy at the beginning of the pandemic. In fact, if you would have told me that I was going to be involved in advocacy, I would have told you that you're crazy. I don't know anything about it. I don't want to be involved in it. But all of a sudden, a crisis occurred and got me to realize, boy, we need to do something about it. So we went from closed facilities here in Michigan to this is myself and two of my colleagues from the MFA testifying before the House Appropriations Committee for $53 million in relief for our industry. Now, when I was driving out here to Lansing that morning, I thought, wow, there's no more impactful thing that I can be doing for our industry right now than driving out here to have that conversation with lawmakers. Now, we didn't get $53 million. We got $8.5 million. But to our knowledge, that was the first time in the history of our industry that a state or federal agency or government gave money directly to an entity in our industry for the express purpose of improving the health and well-being of the population of the state. And we are currently appropriating that grant to subawardees in the state. We got our grant check relatively recently. First $4.25 million went out the door. Second $4.25 million is going out the door a little later on. That dollar amount should speak to the importance of the advocacy work that we do. That's a transformative amount of money. Not just for the facilities that we appropriated it to, but also it endowed our organization as a trade association administratively. So now we have a trade association here in Michigan that can do what Alyssa and I were doing, this past May, at the Capitol, which was an advocacy day. We were actually having conversations with lawmakers proactively. I actually developed a relationship with a guy who, at the time, worked for the OSHA here in Michigan, my OSHA, Michigan OSHA. And he told me at the beginning of the pandemic, they looked for somebody in our industry to call to talk about how we could be opened appropriately. He couldn't figure out who to call. Turns out there was no one to call. Right? I mean, what an indictment on our industry's lack of preparedness for things in the policy sphere. And I'll actually tell you about a conversation that Alyssa and I were having with lawmakers that past May in Lansing here, that was some very onerous legislation that we were actually able to shut down because of the conversations we have. Great advocacy is not always about getting money. Sometimes it's about stopping something really bad from happening. So I think my experience during the pandemic was encapsulated by this quote. The first person I heard say this quote was Liz Clark, who's the CEO of the Health Fitness Association, formerly IHRSA. If you don't have a seat at the table, you're on the menu. And we were decidedly on the menu during COVID. And I got to tell you, I don't know where you guys stand on this, but they closed us down. And then when they were reopening us with bars and restaurants and adult entertainment facilities. Like, if getting shut down was like the punch to the face, like that was the punch to the gut. Like, I was actually sitting, I spoke at a gubernatorial press conference here in Lansing, and I was sitting no further away from the governor than I am from you right here when she said that restaurants and bars can go from 33% capacity to 50% capacity, and said nothing about our industry's capacity increasing. So it was clear in my eyes, and again, this is not a political statement, it's clear in my eyes that the policymakers view our industry as largely entertainment, or at least how they used to view our industry. I hope that view is changing. So that is the problem with politics. But the good news is that pretty much everyone can universally agree that taking a walk outside and moving your body is a good thing to do. I've had the chance to talk to lawmakers on both sides of the aisle, people who are very aligned ideologically with me, people who are aligned ideologically very different than me. In fact, that picture of the three of us testifying before the House Appropriations Committee was taken by a lawmaker who arguably is the opposite end of the political spectrum that I am. Yet we developed a great relationship because she agreed that people being physically active was a good thing. So the great thing about advocating in our industry is it's pretty apolitical. I say pretty apolitical because I don't know if anything necessarily is completely apolitical nowadays. But most people will agree that moving your body is generally speaking a good thing. And it doesn't matter who I talk about on either side of the aisle, they all agree that, you know what, we should figure out ways for people to be more physically active. And so I think that's an advantage. Not even in the nutrition space has this. Nutrition, it can be very partisan, and there's a lot of big lobbies in the nutrition space that make advocacy for nutrition groups very challenging. I was talking with a very high-ranking member of the Public Service Corps when I was in Washington, D.C. last fall, and she had just left a nutrition conversation, and she came to a meeting that I was at, and she said, man, you guys are so much more aligned. There's so much less tribalism here. Like, this is a much better place to be than with the nutrition people. So I think we have a lot of advantages when we talk about advocacy. But I also realize it's scary to think about being an advocate. Again, if you would have told me that 4 years after the pandemic started, I'd be standing here right now talking to you about advocacy, I would have told you you're crazy. But let's talk about a perspective shift here. I don't know if this is so much about politics, because when you start to hear the word politics, that engenders all kinds of things, unfortunately nowadays, significantly emotional things. So I'd encourage you to not think about this as politics. I'd encourage you to think about this as civic engagement. That's really what I'm talking about here. And civic engagement is really, it's working to make a difference in the life of our communities. Isn't that what we're already doing to some degree? I know a number of you in the room who are making profound differences in your community. And civic engagement's about promoting quality of life. Now, it's different than what we do in the micro level of our facilities on a day-by-day basis. This is done on a more macro level. So this is policy and systems change work. And when you can create the right policy and systems environment around you, it greases the skids to make all the work we do in our individual facilities that much easier and that much more impactful. And we're going to talk about some of the policy and systems work that is currently going on right now, industry-wide, that I think is incredibly, incredibly exciting, and hopefully this gives you an opportunity to be informed and be able to engage. So again, I would highly encourage you to not think of this as lobbying or politics. Think of this as civic engagement. And civic engagement is the 3 T's and a V. So it's time, talent, treasure, and then voting. We're not going to have a lecture on the importance of getting out and voting today, but it is election season, and we should be blessed. We're blessed to be in a country where we actually have the ability to do that. There's a great book that I recommend for anyone that is just kind of interested in getting more involved in civic engagement, or also that is just so stressed out by the political environment that you don't even know what to do. The name of the book is Democracy in Retrograde, kind of taken from the whole Mercury in retrograde kind of thing. The woman that writes the book does an absolutely outstanding job of talking about how you can be involved in civic engagement, mostly in your local communities, because as we're going to talk about as we go throughout this conversation, all health is local and all politics is local at the end of the day. That's where you have the ability to make the most impact. So these are the 3 big topics we're going to cover. We're going to understand our rights as U.S. citizens, at least on a very, very basic level. The types of advocacy, and then the action steps. Ultimately, that's really what I want this to be. I want this to be the action steps for you to move towards advocacy. So let's start by understanding our rights. So at the risk of taking you back to your, 8th grade social studies or civics class, we get to look at the First Amendment of the Constitution. And everyone seems to remember the freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly part of the First Amendment. But we often forget about this petition for a redress of grievances, which is a fancy way of saying to talk to your lawmakers, to talk to the policymakers about the things that aren't quite working so well for you. And again, if you would have told me in 2019 that a small group of people, and the group of people that started the Michigan Fitness Association were just that, there were 7 of us that started it, actually had the ability to petition the government for redress of grievances and actually have those conversations, I would have said, I don't think that's possible. And then, literally 4 years later, I'm here to tell you that we've done it at the state level and we've done it at the federal level. It's a civic duty and a privilege to be able to do this. I mean, there are a lot of countries that you get killed for doing this. Yet we can do it here. We can do it here. And I think the framers might have been talking to us, because this is actually an exercise, right? How about that? Not only is it a civic duty and a privilege, but it's also an exercise. And I think we can all relate to that. So what grievances might we have? Well, closure during a public health crisis, could have been that. Zoning requirements, that affects a lot of our businesses. Taxation of health and fitness club memberships. Currently, our memberships are not taxed. In several states, there has been legislation that they've pushed towards to tax our membership, kind of putting it in categories of other entertainment. Fortunately, for the most part, our industry has defended against that successfully. Online cancel of memberships. If you sign up online, you should be able to cancel online. One of the conversations we've been having here in Lansing is a conversation around not click to cancel, but click to initiate cancel. We all know, I mean, I know from personal experience from my business that when somebody wants to initiate a cancellation, we want to have a conversation with them before they cancel, right? Not because we want to keep their money, but we want to make sure it's not an impulsive decision and we have their best health in mind. So just clicking that cancel button after you've had a bad night with like some Haagen-Dazs and some pizza is not helpful for any of our businesses. Membership auto renewal requirements. I said that Alyssa and I were up here in Lansing in May to talk to lawmakers about some really onerous legislation. So listen to this. They were going to enact legislation that largely I think is a good thing to help people avoid junk fees. Like you don't know, you sign up for a trial on an app and somehow the app is just billing you and billing you and billing you constantly, right? Well, they were lumping our industry into that category. And what this particular lawmaker was looking to do, and listen carefully to this, was he was looking for us to notify every single member every month that they were going to be billed. Every single member, every single month. And he was getting traction with this. Could you imagine the administrative nightmare and he wasn't just talking about emails alone. He was talking about phone calls in some cases. It was clear he had no understanding of the constraints of our industry. And we had a conversation with this lawmaker, and we basically educated him on how what we do in a membership model is different than a subscription model. And then as we had those conversations, all of a sudden he said, okay, yeah, this is different. And all of a sudden, that part of the legislation went away. If we had not been having that conversation here in Michigan, or if a similar conversation is going on in your state and you're not a part of it, if you don't have that seat at the table, you are on the menu. So we absolutely, that's not a win like getting $8.5 million where we can stand up, pound our chest and like, look at all this money we got. That's preventing something bad from happening that would have been infinitely worse than the benefits that $8.5 million gave us. So that's referred to as defensive advocacy, and it might be some of the most important form of advocacy that's out there. Data privacy, gender neutral locker rooms. I know this is a challenge for everybody right now who has locker rooms. I can tell you we are pretty certain, but we will defend it vehemently here in Michigan, that there probably is a class action lawsuit on its way for locker rooms in our industry. Our trade association has got wind of it. We've had some conversations with some people. It's kind of a no-win situation, right? I mean, any of you who have had to deal with the locker room issue, it is a real challenge. It's expensive to put in new locker rooms, right? To put in gender neutral locker rooms. It's complex to be able to police that. Normally it's your high school or college student at a front desk that's trying to police it, which is terribly difficult. So we're trying to work on what that language should look like here in Michigan for our industry to make sure it's not overly onerous. And those are things that cost real money and cause real problems in a business. And something I'm very much involved in, which we'll talk about, which, I realize some of the stuff I'm talking about is like, wow, that's super scary that those conversations are even happening or those things are happening. But there's also some positive things, like exercise professionals that are highly qualified being conferred the status of qualified healthcare professional. And there's a movement underway at the federal level to make that happen. So yeah, there's some scary stuff that's going on that we need to prevent, but there's also some things that we're working towards that can really elevate our industry. And going along with that is, how do we get insurance reimbursement for what we do, which I believe is not that far off. And by not that far off, I mean like a decade. So let's talk about advocacy. So what is advocacy? Well, what I'm doing right now is advocacy. What you do when you talk to people in your community about exercise and being healthy, that's advocacy. And you're speaking for and supporting or representing a group of people. We do advocacy all the time. You might be speaking to defend someone in court, and maybe that's not something we do as frequently, but we already do advocacy. That's the great thing about people in our industry. We are natural advocates for what we do. Like, what I realized as soon as I started to formally advocate for our industry is I've been advocating literally my entire career. I just reoriented that advocacy to the policymakers and the decision makers that actually can have a substantive influence on the policies and systems that affect something that I'm really passionate about in our industry. So we already do advocacy. And I'm going to say this now, and you heard me say this multiple times in the presentation. The best of us need to be the ones that are doing the advocacy. And I truly believe people involved in medical fitness are the best of us, from a quality, from a skill perspective, from an ability to be articulate about the evidence base. I think there are a lot of great people in the industry that do a lot of great things, but we already know the vast majority of our industry is really good at getting the fit fitter and the healthy healthier. We are a group of people that are good at getting the people who are not fit, in fact, people who are chronically diseased and disabled. We're the group that gets those people better. So we're a decidedly different voice in this conversation. So I talk about advocacy to a lot of different groups, and I always want the best of the best to be doing advocacy, and I really believe that medical fitness is the group of people that should be doing the most advocacy in our industry. So, you already heard me mention this a little bit. Types of advocacy, defensive advocacy. So stopping something bad from happening. This is the most common form of advocacy that exists. Lawmakers get all kinds of ideas in their mind from all kinds of different people. And by and large, what I've learned about most lawmakers and politicians is that their primary concern most of the time is getting reelected and doing more lawmaking, right? So they're not in a position to be an expert on anything, really. Like, when you talk to most lawmakers about most things, they're not an expert. They have people on staff that are, somewhat subject matter experts in certain areas. Like a health policy person, is an example of somebody who'd be kind of an expert in what we do, but they're nowhere near the subject matter experts that we are in what we do. And just like when we were having that conversation with the lawmaker around the acknowledgement and the notification of auto bill, he just had no idea. He actually had one bad experience with a Planet Fitness, and that shaped his entire view of what the industry was. And I actually know the gentleman that runs all the Planet Fitnesses in Michigan, and the experience he said he had and the experience it sounds like he had were two very different things, but that's not what ended up on the pages of Crane's Detroit Business, which those things causes problems. So defensive advocacy. And then offensive advocacy. How can we go about doing things that shape the policy and the system environment to favor the things that our industry needs to do to not just survive, but to thrive? I mean, we've transitioned, thankfully, out of the post-pandemic survival phase. But now we need to think about what do we do to thrive. And so, let's talk about the steps in, I feel like this is the Schoolhouse Rock, how a bill becomes a bill, right? For those of you that are old enough to remember that. So let's talk about the steps in legislation becoming law. Because it's actually really important that you know these, because it shows you where you can intervene. So the first thing that happens is a bill is drafted. Somebody drafts a bill. We've been involved in drafting bills at the MFA, at the Michigan Fitness Association, and then what ends up happening is you can send it to a lawmaker who is interested in your cause, and they have legislative counsel, legislative lawyers, that will clean it up. So again, if you would have told me I was going to be drafting a bill, I don't even know the first place to start with that. But you just put the context in, and then someone that has the institutional knowledge of the political system puts all the legal language in place. Then the bill gets introduced to one of the chambers of Congress, House or Senate, and then it goes into committee for review. So as an example of what I was talking about earlier with that acknowledgement of auto renew that we successfully shut down, Lawmaker drafted the bill. It got introduced into the House here in Michigan. It was in committee. It was in the committee when we actually started to intervene from an advocacy perspective, which is a really important point in time to intervene because that's when there hasn't been a lot of traction. And then it could get passed out of a committee, and then it has to go to the whole chamber for discussion, and then if it's successfully voted out of that whole chamber, goes over to the other chamber, does its thing, right? If you're wondering why there's so much gridlock in Washington, like this is among the reasons. And then it has to have chief executive action. It either gets signed into law, or at that point it gets vetoed, and if it gets vetoed, it can go back, and that's the process. We can intervene on any one of these steps that you see right here. The earlier on in the process, the better. I'm going to talk about how you can become aware of the bills that are being drafted and talked about in your state legislatures. If you see something that's happening that you know involves our industry, you can get involved at that drafting level. That is the best level to get involved. The higher up you are in this process, the greater the chances of success of kind of bending the policy in a favorable direction. Like if you're sitting there trying to, just imagine if that legislation on acknowledgement of auto renew made it all the way to Governor Whitmer's desk here in Michigan. What do you think the likelihood is that our trade association is going to be able to get in front of Governor Whitmer to encourage her to veto that at that point? Like nil. Right? So we were right here. It was in committee. It just got introduced to committee. We knew what was going on, and we were there to have the conversation. And it's actually still in committee and being talked about, but our language is removed. So our industry is not going to be affected by this piece of legislation. So again, there's all kinds of ways that you can be involved, but a lot of this is simply just informing people. That's really what lobbying is. Lobbying is informing and educating. You're having a conversation with people about things they simply don't know. Sometimes you're educating the lawmaker themselves. A lot of other times, it's their staff. Many times, it looks like you're talking to a 17-year-old because it's a very young staff. And I mean, I'll never forget the first time we had a meeting on the grant we were looking to get here in Michigan, that $8.5 million. And the person that we met with literally looked like she was 14 years old. I thought we were going to meet with the lawmaker, and it looked like there was a 14-year-old on the screen in front of me. And I was just like, oh, this is not going to be good. But it turns out that those people actually have a large amount of influence over their lawmaker. And it also turns out that those are the people that become the chiefs of staff in the future, the policy directors in the future, and the lawmakers in the future. In fact, somebody that I developed a relationship early on in COVID is now a chief of staff for a prominent House of Representatives member in Washington, D.C. And when I started talking to her early in COVID, she was not even like an assistant chief of staff for a state-level House of Representative person. So if you do get involved in advocacy and you do talk to someone that looks like they could be your child or your grandchild, don't be too put off by that, because those people actually wield decently significant influence. All right, so let's get to where the rubber meets the road here. Like, you know, if you're with me so far that being an advocate is probably something that's important to do, we need to talk about how we actually do this. And this is a roadmap that I've put together with my colleagues who've gone down this advocacy path from pure experience, from getting a lot of stuff wrong and a few things right. I wish I had this roadmap at the beginning of COVID. I really wish I did, because if nothing else, it would have made me feel a little bit more confident about what I was embarking on. But fortunately for me and for some of my colleagues, and I hope for somebody like you, you don't have to have confidence in something to start something. You just start, and then the confidence comes. So here's the steps. Be passionate, stay informed, build relationships, be involved as a grassroots advocate, and then political engagement. So we're going to talk about each one of these, and we're going to start with be passionate. This is table stakes. You have to be passionate if you're an advocate. I've never seen a compelling advocate for something that is not passionate. This is typically not a concern in our industry. Fortunately, we are in this industry because we're passionate about helping people move, making people healthier. Let's be honest, we're all really smart people. If we wanted to make $1 million, we would have gone into another industry. It's always what I tell my students in the 100 level class that I teach at University of Michigan. I said, who wants to make $1 million? Like 3 or 4 kids raised their hand. I'm like, the Ross Business School is right down the road. You go down there, they'll teach you how to make $1 million. We're here because we want to make a difference. And passion leads to persistence. That's really what it leads to, right? Because if you're passionate about something, if it's tied to your core identity and your core values, it is really, really hard to give up on something like that. And we need professionals that are not just passionate, but they're educated and they're articulate. We need professionals that are going to advocate, that are the best of what we have to offer in our industry. And again, I believe that is medical fitness. We don't need the fitfluencer on Instagram who's got chains around his shoulders, that's doing lunges on BOSUs while doing curls, in a posing trunks, right? Like, that's not the person we need talking to lawmakers. Fortunately, those people generally don't seem to talk to lawmakers. So stay informed. If there's nothing else that you take out of my talk today, this is a step that you can do that is, it's not a passive step by any stretch of the imagination, because staying informed in this day and age of information overload is a challenge. But this is the lowest level of engagement that you can make from an advocacy perspective, because if you're in the know, then you can decide when to act. And what I tend to find is that most people are not in the know about what's happening in the policy and systems environment that can affect our industry. Like, if you're not in the state of Michigan, Michigan is the only state that has a state trade association left out of all the ones that were formed during COVID. And I'm going to be honest, a lot of it has to do with that money that we are able to get from the state. Money can endow something and keep it going. But if you don't have a state trade association representing you in your state, there's a good chance that there's probably some legislation that is being talked about right now that could have a negative effect on our industry. And that's just a lack of staying informed. Because even if you don't have a formal trade association in your state, if you know that something bad could happen in the industry, you can band people together really fast to address that issue. And we've seen that around the country. There's been some issues in other states that don't have state trade associations where, because somebody had their pulse on what was happening legislatively, they said, oh man, that's going to be an issue. They started calling up people, they banded a group of people together, and they successfully defeated onerous legislation. So it starts by staying informed. And certainly being aware of things that are happening on the federal level is important and nice, but it's the state level and it's the local level that you really need to be informed of. That's the critical level that can really affect your business. Reading local and state business publications are really helpful. Here in Michigan, Crane's Detroit Business, or Crane's insert, whatever region of the state you're in, is a great publication to read. But find those business publications. They will talk about things that are happening legislatively that may not directly name our industry, but you see it and you go, oh man, that could affect our industry. And then it's always going to have the bill number in there, so you just go online, HR 501, you look it up and you're like, oh wow, this could be bad. We might need to do something about this. How I learned about the lawmaker that had the bad experience with Planet Fitness, who was pushing this notification of auto renew, was I was literally sitting there reading Crane's, and I was reading an article on something that I thought had nothing to do with our industry initially. And then I'm reading, and then all of a sudden I read this quote about a Planet Fitness in Dearborn, Michigan. And I'm like, all right, well, our head's on the chopping block right now, so we better figure out what this is. Most states have legislative tracking websites. That's the good thing. You could literally look up, legislative tracker, insert state here, and it will show you all of the bills that are going through your state. And again, unless you're a policy wonk, you're probably not going to sit there and look at all of those. But some of the legislative trackers have the ability to look for certain things, certain words that might be relevant to our industry. The Health and Fitness Association, which is formerly IHRSA, They've really transformed a lot of what they've done since COVID. Admittedly, they will tell you that they were, I don't know what's worse than being caught flat-footed, but that's where URSA was, when the pandemic started. They've now transformed into a reasonably strong advocacy organization that is now more DC-based than anything else. They have monthly legislative updates that you could subscribe to. So you guys are all going to get this presentation afterwards. There's a number of hyperlinks in here that you can click to just sign up for stuff. So that generally speaking is federal level legislation, but also some of the more onerous state level legislation that it's actually made its way out of committee that they'll report about in there. And then the Physical Activity Alliance is the nation's largest group of physical activity stakeholders that works on policy and systems change work with the federal government, with Health and Human Services, and with Centers for Disease Control. I'm a board member of the Physical Activity Alliance and involved in a lot of their work. This is more, where the bills are more kind of direct, largely defensive advocacy you'd want to be involved in. PAA is involved in offensive advocacy, and we'll talk a little bit more about Physical Activity Alliance when we get a little further in the presentation. But we have a monthly newsletter, PAAmovewithus.org. Go to the website, sign up for that newsletter. If you did nothing else, and you did the HFA's monthly legislative update, and you did the PAA's newsletter, you'd be in the know about legislation, and you'd be in the know about essentially what's happening from an offensive advocacy standpoint in our space. Now here in Michigan, we have two things to take a look at a little further. And certainly if you're not from Michigan, you could also take a look at these. The Michigan Move Coalition is a nonprofit that I actually started that is working with the Department of Health and Human Services to develop, implement, and then measure the effect of a state-level physical activity plan. So we're going to take the national plan and we're going to pull it down to the state level. We're going to prioritize the strategies and tactics and objectives, and then we are going to work on implementation at the local community level. We have a member of the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services that sits on our board of directors. We have financial backing from the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services and the Michigan Health Endowment Fund. And one of our board members is the incoming chair of the National Physical Activity Plan. I know all of you are aware of the National Physical Activity Plan. You probably think the same thing that I think about it, which is it's a white paper on a shelf that doesn't do very much. And that's exactly what it was intended to be. It was never intended to be an implementation document. So what we're doing here in Michigan is we're pulling it down to the state level, and Michigan Moves will actually fund implementation initiatives in local communities. We're working on a state level physical activity report card and a number of other things with MDHHS. And then I mentioned the Michigan Fitness Association. You could check out our website by going there. Membership is available for any for-profit fitness entities in the state. So if you're nonprofit, we're not a nonprofit trade association. However, you certainly can sign up for our newsletters and get our information and collaborate with us, because we are the group that is advocating for you. And if you're from another state and you might be so inspired to start your own state alliance, I'm happy to have a conversation with you about how to do that, because it doesn't take a lot of knowledge to do it, because by the end of this presentation, you will have more knowledge about what it takes than what I had back in May of 2020. So, oh man, these are all going to be individual bullets. We don't want to do that. David, it's your fault. So in September, October, which actually will come out probably in a couple weeks, the issue of the ACSM's Health Fitness Journal is going to be on professionalization and advocacy in our industry. So ACSM reached out to me and asked me to be the guest editor for this journal issue. And so it was my job to go around and talk to all of the leading stakeholders in the advocacy and professionalization effort about all the things that are being done and put it into one volume that people could read. And that's what this is. So you see all the articles that are in this issue. If you are an ACSM member, you'll have access to this. If you're not, you're going to get access to 2 articles. 3 articles. I actually asked them if they'd make this whole issue open access to everyone. Obviously, ACSM makes their money from these kind of things, so they weren't willing to give me that, but they were willing to give me 3 articles. So everyone will have open access to 3 articles in this issue, but everything in this issue is so rich in terms of its knowledge of the professionalization effort in our field. And what is the professionalization effort? It is taking highly qualified exercise professionals and transitioning them inside of healthcare by conferring them the status of qualified healthcare professional. Same thing a dietitian has, same thing a physical therapist has, same thing an athletic trainer has. We've been on the outside looking in for so long, we are knocking on that door right now. And this issue explains all the things that are happening. I cannot tell you how great the authors for this issue were. These are literally the leaders in the space. And if anybody wants to be informed about what's happening, that might be the single best source to go to. I'm not here to advocate for an ACSM membership, but the annual cost of an ACSM membership would be worth the price of admission to this journal issue. You got it, Andy? Got it. Man, the presenter just died on me. All right, we're going to stay here. So let's talk about building relationships. So we'll switch gears. So now this is a little more active. We're not just reading, we're not just learning about things, we're actually building relationships. And you've heard this said many times, and it is 1,000% true. All politics is local. So start local. Start with your Chamber of Commerce. Start with your city council. Start with your mayor. Right? Start with your local state level congressional representative, right? These people all care about you. Why do they care about you? Yes, because you're the ones that get them reelected, right? When you're a constituent, they will have a conversation with you. There's a reason that when we go to DC and do an advocacy day with the Health Fitness Association, that I am meeting with the Michigan delegation and I'm not meeting with the Ohio delegation because they want to talk to one of their constituents. So these are relationships that you can start to develop. You can connect with your member of Congress. Honestly, in a lot of cases, it's probably not going to be directly your member of Congress. It's probably going to be one of their staff members. But that's a great place to start a relationship. They will have a meeting with you. If you send an email, somebody from that office will actually have a meeting with you. Now, you probably need to have something to talk about in that meeting. It's generally best just to not waste their time and say hi. But there's a way to get in contact with these people. And again, this is one of the amazing things about the democracy that we live in, is that we actually have this reasonably unfettered access to the people that are the decision makers. And I think a lot of people are very kind of fatalistic when it comes to politics, like, oh, I can't do anything about it. Well, what I always say to them is, well, what have you tried to do? Because when you start to try to do stuff, it turns out you can do stuff. And getting to know the staff, I think is really, really important. So when I am having conversations with a new staffer that I've not met before, I actually try to find out what's important to them. I mean, LinkedIn is a great resource, initially, just to kind of see what their background is like. See what policy priorities they might be interested. Learn about what policy priorities the person they're working for is interested in, and then you start to figure out who you can go to introduce legislation. So we had to do some pretty significant recon prior to introducing that bill for the aid for industry in the state to know which lawmaker would be favorable to introduce this. So when you're talking about building a political relationship, so my staff here probably find the know, like, trust framework to be consistent. It's the same thing we do all the time. First, people got to know you, then they got to like you, and then they got to trust you, right? And that's how you build any good relationship in life. And those steps are really, really important. And really, I think what it boils down to is, how can you provide value to the person you're trying to build a relationship with? And certainly getting reelected is some value that you can provide them. But more importantly, information and PR opportunities are great ways to provide value to people. Information is critical to a lot of these staffers and the lawmakers that they work for, because they just simply don't know. Like this rep that was looking to introduce this bill on notification of auto renewal, he just didn't know. And we didn't go in there like, you're going to destroy our industry and this is going to be the end of everything. We were like, it's interesting what you're doing. Can we explain to you a little bit about how our business works and how this would affect us? And he listened. And all of a sudden, we were able to stop something bad from happening. PR opportunities, right? We do amazing things in our facilities. When you're going to do something amazing that's a larger group event, invite your local lawmaker out. They love to take pictures with people. They have kids, babies, dogs, the whole thing, right? I mean, think about some of the cool things you've done in your facilities that you could have invited a lawmaker out to, right? So you're giving them a public relations opportunity. Maybe you don't need anything from them at that point in time. But I bet eventually at some point you're going to need something from them, and then you've already established some value with them ahead of time. And you do have to do the cost-benefit analysis of public relationships with political individuals, right? I kind of glossed over donations. That is a real thing. I mean, money talks in politics. We know that. I have donated money to both sides of the aisle because it was advantageous from a political perspective for a cause that we were looking to support. But I do think you have to be aware of, particularly if it's a very divisive political figure, bringing that person into your environment. The good news is, for the most part, at the local level, there's not a tremendous amount of divisiveness around political figures. That starts to happen when you get to the state and certainly the federal level. But at the local level, everyone, for the most part, everyone likes their local mayor, right? The local mayor is normally a pretty likable individual. That's not across the board, but that's largely true. So, you got to do the calculus on that. And in this day and age, it's a challenging calculus to do. So let's talk about grassroots advocacy. Find a cause you're passionate about. And the question is there a more hyper-focused cause than just broadly the cause of our industry? If you're really going to do it, you have to form a coalition. You absolutely have to. You can't go it alone, right? You don't have the time, you don't have the money, and practically speaking, you really don't wield the influence until it's a larger group of people. Let's go back to what I said earlier. Lawmakers are interested in getting reelected. The more of their constituents that are involved with something, the more likely they are to listen to you. So when we formed the Michigan Moves Coalition, and we brought together the SHAPE, the Society of Health and Physical Educators, the PE teachers, we brought together the American Physical Therapy Association from Michigan, the Michigan Fitness Association, the Parks and Rec, Trinity Health, American Heart Association. We brought this big coalition together. We sat down with the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, and they said, wow, look at all these groups that you have here, right? So it's not only the depth and breadth of the knowledge that made a difference, but it was also the fact that we had a coalition. Coalition building is not hard when you have a unified cause that you're passionate about. I had zero problems getting all those groups involved because I said, we're going to figure out a way to make Michigan the most physically active state in the country. And they're like, right on, let's go. Right? That wasn't much of a thought for any of those groups. It is important, if you are going to really do some strong grassroots advocacy, that you find a lawmaker that's aligned with your cause. And this just takes a little bit of work. But here in Michigan, we found lawmakers that are very much aligned with our cause. And again, when it's physical activity, it's not a hard thing to do, particularly when you talk about physical activity with our youth. One of the things that has, in my observation, has caught lawmakers' attention more than anything else that I talk about is the concept of physical literacy. Some of you may be familiar with that concept. That's basically the confidence and competence to move your body throughout the lifespan. As soon as you attach the term literacy to something, people start to listen, right? I literally stopped the lawmaker that actually took that picture when we were testifying, dead in her tracks with that. I said, we're looking to make our population more physically illiterate. And she said, wait, what? And then I explained to her the concept of physical literacy, and all of a sudden, that stuck. Things that involve our kids are very, very strong motivators. You can, in some cases, propose drafting legislation. Again, I know this sounds scary, but find that aligned lawmaker, and their staff will help you draft the legislation. Again, physical activity legislation normally is not controversial legislation. And I think, to the extent you can be, offensively advocate in the process is important, not just defensive advocacy. I mean, I think that, again, that's the most common form of advocacy that's done, but you gotta have wins if you're actually gonna really energize your coalition. Because we stop something bad from happening is a difficult platform to stand on all the time, right? Like, as an aside, I think a lot of times that's what we have done in the past in our industry is, like, we've prevented people from getting sick. Like, that's been kind of our industry's thing. Like, we help prevent illness. Well, it's hard to actually quantify a negative, right? But if we start to get to, hey, we did something positive, like we got $8.5 million here in Michigan, that's a win that you can stand on and you can build from that. So I don't think it can just be defensive advocacy if you're gonna really empower your coalition. All right, so let's talk about political engagement. And I saved this one for last because this is the most fraught level of engagement. Vote, please be an informed voter. Please vote on policy, not on emotion. This is a soapbox I can stand on for a while. Support a candidate you're aligned with. Could be your time, could be your talent, could be your treasure, could be all three. You can attend an industry advocacy event. That's a link to the IHRSA fly-in, the Health Fitness Association fly-in in DC last May, where roughly about 120 of us from around the country went to Capitol Hill to talk with lawmakers about a handful of different things, one of which is the FIT Act, P-H-I-T Act, which those of you who've been in the industry for a while will shake your heads and roll your eyes both at the same time at the FIT Act, as I see Deb smiling, who's been around long enough to know we've been working on that for a while. That actually may get passed in 2025. The FIT Act would amend the tax code to allow HSAs and FSAs to be used for our services without a letter of medical necessity. Now, again, this has been worked on for, I don't know, 15, 20 years now. It's been worked on for a while. We actually have a pretty sufficient bipartisan support for it in DC, and in 2025, they're opening up the tax code again. And they're going to do some work on the tax code. So now we might have the ability to actually do something with that. And that's an advocacy event that you could be a part of. And you go and they teach you what to say, how to say. You literally on Capitol Hill with a lobbyist who understands the technical stuff. And we met with, I was with a group that was Michigan, Ohio, and I don't know why they had me representing Ohio. I was just saying bad things. But Michigan, Ohio, and Minnesota, and we actually met with Amy Klobuchar. Like, she actually took a meeting with our group, which was great. Now, in my group, we had the chief legal counsel for Lifetime Fitness, and we also had the head lobbyist for Self-Esteem Brands, which owns Anytime. So that's probably why Senator Klobuchar took the meeting. But we met with other reps. I met with Gary Peters here in Michigan. I was the only representative from Michigan, and clearly I'm not Lifetime Fitness or Anytime Fitness. So you could actually meet with the lawmakers. It's a very, it's my favorite thing I do during the year. It's very surreal to walk around the halls of the Capitol and be able to meet with these people. You can contribute to a political action committee. You guys have heard of these PACs before. Most of the time you hear about them, it's not in the nicest of light. But the reality is, if you're going to get stuff done in politics, you need money to support the candidates that are going to do the things for you. And so I'll give you a story right from the lips of Liz Clark, the current CEO of the Health Fitness Association. She came to the Health Fitness Association from another association. Does anyone know what it is before I say it? Okay, it's kind of cringeworthy, so bear with me. She came from the National Confectioners Association, so she basically represented Big Sugar, right? They had such strong legislative relationships because the money that they were able to donate as the National Confectioners Association, that when they got wind that the confectioners were going to be shut down during COVID, she was able to make 3 phone calls to prominent senators, and all of a sudden, the industry that drives diabetes and obesity, which was the worst thing for COVID outcomes, was wide open to produce all of their COVID exacerbating foods, right? Because they had the money to make the call, right? So the reality is, money's a thing. This is an individual contribution you can make, a maximum of $5,000 per year. It actually goes to support the direct legislative work that is done in DC. again, you don't have to do it, but you got to sometimes put your money where your mouth is when it comes to some of these things. So, what's the summary here? Well, first, I think it's our civic duty to do this. Like, set industry aside. Like, even if you hear this and you're like, yeah, I have no interest in advocating for our industry. I just do my thing, I go home and I'm good. Advocate for something else that matters for you. Maybe you live on a street where people go way too fast and you have kids that are afraid you're going to get hit by a car. Advocate for a speed bump, right? Like, that's something you actually can do. So this is a civic duty, and it is a privilege. And that is one of the great things about living in this country, is that we have the ability to be able to do this. I mean, at its core, that's what autonomy is, right? And we all thrive off of autonomy, and this is one of the most active and systemic ways you can do it. You got to remember that if you don't have a seat at the table, you are on the menu. And you can't wait till you're on the menu to try to get the seat at the table. That's what we did during COVID, and guess what? We couldn't get to the table fast enough. And it affected us. Here in the state of Michigan, to the best of our knowledge, 40% of the industry permanently closed here in Michigan. 40%, right? And that's just based on what we know. Like, it actually probably was more than that when you consider all the small mom and pop businesses that we didn't have access to, right? If you don't have a seat at the table, you're on the menu. Physical activity is a non-partisan thing. It really, really is, right? You're just talking about getting people moving. And I've not heard any pushback from either side of the aisle on that. Certainly, you got to be smart about how you frame your argument along ideological lines, but everyone's smart enough to figure out, if you're talking to one person versus another, how you got to frame things. But movement is non-partisan. There is defensive advocacy and there is offensive advocacy. The defensive advocacy requires you to be informed, and it is absolutely critical. If somebody in your state is not in the know about what's happening legislatively, you have to assume, not because someone's going to do it intentionally, like was going to happen here in Michigan, but something is coming down the pike that is going to affect you in a way that's not going to be positive. And you have to be prepared for that. And again, go back to 2 above. The point where you learn about that, you can't be trying to get your seat at the table then. Like, we already had the connections here in Lansing to meet with that rep literally within 3 weeks of us finding that out to intervene at the right point. Know how and when to intervene in the process. Again, the earlier on in the process you intervene, the better. And we talked about the steps to advocacy. Being passionate, staying informed. Again, staying informed, I feel like, is just a professional responsibility in our field. If this is your career and this is what you do, it's just as much a professional responsibility to be informed about what's going on in the policy and systems environment as it is to do your continuing education credits so you maintain your certification. It is the other side of the coin of professional responsibility. Build those relationships. If you don't know who your local mayor is, if you don't know who your city council is, learn who those people are, figure out where you can build the relationships and you can build value for those individuals. Consider grassroots advocacy. Again, it sounds scary, but it's something that everyone can absolutely do, provided they have a coalition to do it with. It's going to be really difficult for, unless you're a name that we all know, like Bezos or Musk or somebody like that, it's very difficult for you to do advocacy on your own. You need to build a coalition. And, if you can make it through all those steps and you're willing to do it, get involved politically, some way, somehow. Again, because of the work we do in the physical activity space, that political engagement is not as scary as what you think it might be. Thank you. I was going to ask if anybody had questions, but like David and Jake are walking up here like their pants are on fire, so I don't know if I have time for questions. Do I have time for questions?
Well, we're kind of at time.
Shocking with me. Well, hey, I'm going to be around most of the day. That's my contact information. Thank you so much.
All right, let's give a hand to Mike.
Was I not supposed to go to 10? Was it 10?
We have a 50-minute session. We have 10 minutes now for networking, and we have food, talk to our sponsors.